My friends, the Detroit Lions have barely opened training camp, and already one storyline has everyone asking questions. Instead of the focus being entirely on players getting back on the field, the biggest discussion has become the opening PUP list, and one name in particular has once again left fans wondering what is really happening behind the scenes. Kerby Joseph created optimism with his own comments, but just one day later, he officially appeared on the physically unable to perform list. If that sounds familiar, it's because Lions fans have seen something very similar before. That's what makes this situation so strange. Kerby Joseph recently spoke with confidence about his recovery, saying his faith remained unbreakable, that he could walk again, and that he was no longer dealing with the same pain he experienced during the Kansas game. Naturally, those comments led many fans to believe he would be ready to participate when camp opened. Instead, the exact opposite happened, as the Lions placed him on the PUP list to begin training camp. Before anyone panics, it's important to understand exactly what this designation means. During training camp, the PUP list is essentially a precautionary measure. Players placed there are not lost for the season, and they are eligible to return whenever the medical staff clears them. Unlike the regular season version of the PUP list, there is currently no requirement for them to miss games. The Lions can activate these players at any point during camp as soon as they are healthy enough to practice. That context is extremely important because some fans immediately associate the PUP designation with a long-term injury, but that's simply not the case right now. Detroit still has several weeks before the regular season begins, so there is no reason to rush key contributors back onto the field before they are completely ready. Even so, it's impossible to ignore the frustration surrounding the mixed signals. This isn't the first time Lions fans have heard encouraging comments from Kerby Joseph, only to see reality unfold differently almost immediately afterward. The lesson many supporters are beginning to learn is simple. Instead of reading too much into player comments, it's probably safer to wait for updates directly from Dan Campbell and the coaching staff. Kerby Joseph isn't the only notable player beginning camp on the PUP list either. Brian Branch also starts camp under the same designation. Just like Kerby, this does not automatically mean a lengthy absence. Both players can return whenever they receive medical clearance during training camp. The timing simply reflects the organization's desire to be cautious rather than aggressive with two important defensive contributors. Another interesting name on the list is tight end Tyler Conklin. His inclusion naturally raises questions because many expected him to immediately compete behind Sam LaPorta during camp. Instead, he starts without practicing, leaving fans wondering exactly when he'll be available. The source material does not provide the specific injury or reason for his absence, only that he opens training camp on the PUP list after arriving this offseason. There is also an encouraging historical trend that should calm some of the concern. Mike Payton pointed out that since 2021, the Lions have opened training camp with 13 different players on the PUP list. Every one of those players eventually appeared in regular season games that year and played at least 10 games, with Romeo Okwara being the lone exception. That statistic suggests Detroit has consistently used the PUP designation as a cautious approach rather than an indication of a serious long-term problem. Once you look at it from that perspective, the situation becomes much less alarming. The calendar still says July. Detroit doesn't need these players playing meaningful football today. The coaching staff's priority is making sure they're fully healthy when games actually matter in September. If someone returns tomorrow, next week, or later during camp, the organization still accomplishes its goal of protecting valuable players while allowing the rest of the roster to continue preparing. Beyond the injury updates, training camp also begins to shine a spotlight on one of the most fascinating competitions on the roster, the backup quarterback position. Jared Goff remains firmly established as the starter, while Teddy Bridgewater brings years of experience and veteran leadership. However, there is another quarterback quietly entering the conversation. Luke Altmyer has reportedly generated discussion as someone who could legitimately challenge for that backup role. While Bridgewater's experience naturally gives him an advantage, the idea that Altmyer could force his way into the competition makes this a position worth watching throughout camp. And that's where things start to become even more interesting, because as practices continue, several unexpected roster battles are beginning to emerge across the team, with one highly discussed young player facing perhaps the biggest challenge of his NFL career. Could one of Detroit's most intriguing developmental projects actually be running out of opportunities to secure a roster spot? What do you think about everything happening with the Lions as training camp gets underway? The player generating perhaps the biggest conversation heading into training camp is Giovanni Manu, and honestly, his situation has become one of the most fascinating stories on the entire roster. When Detroit originally drafted him, everyone understood it was going to be a long-term development project. He arrived from Canada with incredible physical traits, tremendous size, and impressive strength, but he also came into the NFL needing significant development before he could realistically contribute. The hope was always that patience would eventually pay off. Now, as another training camp begins, the biggest question is whether that investment is actually moving in the right direction. One of the most surprising developments is that the Lions have been working Giovanni Manu at guard instead of leaving him exclusively at offensive tackle. That immediately raises eyebrows because offensive tackle was always viewed as his natural position. Seeing him shift inside naturally leads to one obvious question. Is Detroit simply trying to increase his versatility, or is this an indication that the coaching staff no longer believes he has a realistic path to earning a role at tackle? When you examine the depth chart, you can understand why this challenge has become so difficult. The tackle group appears remarkably solid. Penei Sewell remains one of the unquestioned cornerstones of the offensive line. Blake Miller is expected to have a major opportunity, while Larry Borom gives Detroit another dependable option. For a long time, many fans assumed NFL teams routinely carried 4 offensive tackles, but the reality often comes down to 3, especially when one of those backups can serve as the valuable swing tackle capable of playing both the left and right sides. That swing tackle role is exactly why Larry Borom's presence is viewed as so important. Last season, the Lions never truly felt comfortable with that position. There were players capable of filling in when necessary, but the roster lacked someone viewed as a true tackle who could confidently step into either starting position if injuries occurred. Borom changes that conversation by giving Detroit a much more stable insurance policy. Unfortunately for Giovanni Manu, that stability also makes his path significantly harder. If the Lions only keep 3 offensive tackles, breaking into that group becomes an enormous challenge. And if he cannot clearly establish himself at tackle, moving inside to guard presents another problem altogether, because Detroit's interior offensive line suddenly looks much stronger than it did a year ago. Just look at the names competing on the inside: Tate Ratledge, Cade Mays, Christian Mahogany, Miles Frazier, Ben Barch, Juice Scruggs. That group represents impressive depth across both guard positions and at center. Compared to last season, the difference is dramatic. The offensive line appears far healthier and much better prepared to handle adversity. The biggest reason for that improved feeling comes from the way Detroit has rebuilt its interior depth after losing Frank Ragnow. Last year, that retirement immediately forced backup players into much larger responsibilities than originally expected. Suddenly, players who were supposed to provide depth became full-time starters, creating understandable concern throughout the offensive line. Now, however, the Lions appear much better positioned. Cade Mays provides an option at center, Juice Scruggs adds additional flexibility, and the guard competition looks considerably deeper. That overall improvement is excellent news for the football team, but it simultaneously makes Giovanni Manu's roster battle even more complicated because he now has to compete against a much stronger group of interior linemen. Looking back at the original draft selection, it's understandable why opinions were divided from the beginning. Manu possessed outstanding measurable traits. He was enormous, exceptionally strong, and clearly offered tremendous physical upside. The belief was that Detroit could develop those raw tools into an NFL caliber player over time, but that approach always carried significant risk. Normally, colleges perform most of that development before players ever reach the professional level. NFL teams generally expect draft picks to arrive much closer to contributing immediately, especially when roster spots become increasingly valuable every season. Investing several years into developing one prospect only pays off if the player eventually earns a meaningful role. Right now, according to the source material, that outcome appears increasingly uncertain. Unless Detroit decides to keep an additional offensive tackle, Giovanni Manu may simply find himself running out of opportunities. That doesn't necessarily mean his talent disappeared or that his work ethic is lacking. Sometimes roster construction simply works against certain players. Stronger depth, healthier competition, and positional flexibility elsewhere can make it incredibly difficult for even talented prospects to secure a place on the final roster. The encouraging part for Lions fans is that situations like this have actually been relatively rare under Brad Holmes. The source points out that Holmes has generally done an outstanding job identifying talent, with far more successful selections than disappointing ones. Every general manager has draft picks that fail to develop exactly as expected, but Detroit's overall track record has largely been one of consistent success. There were draft choices that initially caused fans to question the decision before ultimately becoming tremendous successes. Sam LaPorta is mentioned as an example of someone who surprised people before proving exactly why the Lions believed in him. Amon-Ra St. Brown is another player who exceeded expectations in a remarkable way after some questioned his physical profile coming into the league. Those success stories are exactly why Detroit has earned the benefit of the doubt when evaluating player development. At the same time, Giovanni Manu enters this training camp facing perhaps the most important stretch of his professional career. Every practice, every preseason opportunity, and every snap could determine whether he remains part of the Lions' future plans. As training camp continues, fans will be watching several storylines unfold at once. The recovery of players on the PUP list, the backup quarterback competition, and now one of the most intriguing roster battles involving Giovanni Manu